and welcome to this week's live where we're going to be talking about bone broth. I'm sure many of you know about bone broth or have consumed it before, but I thought it would be a good idea to kind of summarize the history of drinking bone broth, but also just give some um, recipe ideas and ways in which you can make bone broth at home. Um, So to start with, in case anyone isn't aware, bone broth is basically the process of simmering bones and different vegetables in water over time, and extracting the nutrients basically from those products. And bone broth has actually been around since the beginning of humankind, basically. The first records of people drinking bone broth, of course, they wouldn't call it bone broth then, but basically what is essentially little bits of bone or meat, simmered in water. Sorry, the first kind of record of people doing that was around 780,000 years ago. So bone broth has really been a thing that people have done, since the beginning, since the time in which humans used fire for cooking. Um, and this was actually a really important time in history because, as many people kind of speculate on, including Michael Pollan, who is a well-known food writer. He said that the invention of fire is really correlated with a speeding up in the growth of human evolution, because all of a sudden we could eat a lot more things that we couldn't previously eat, because a lot of rooty tubers and vegetables and things like that require cooking before they're edible. So we were able to kind of extract nutrients from foods, as well as animal products, of course. And then that, of course, gives us time to focus on other things. Because if we're constantly just thinking about eating food and foraging, you can think of cows, right? They spend their whole day just eating and grazing, and they don't really do much else because there's just no time for anything else. So cooking is really important in the context of human evolution, and bone broth has been something we've always been eating. Um, And, one thing that was a lot more common than it was now is what's called nose to tail eating. And it's quite trendy. I'm sure many people have kind of seen restaurants that advertise farm to table or nose to tail in specifically eating. And the reason why that's so popular is because there's been a kind of let's say trend or maybe a way in which the mainstream way to eat meat direction has been going in the last years, which is that people will just eat a chicken breast or they will eat a steak, for example. People buy these really specific cuts of meat, and then that's all they buy. People don't really buy heart, they don't buy the feet, they don't buy the organs. And all of these extra parts of the animal are actually a lot more nutrient dense and nutritious than just the muscle meat, like the steak and the chicken breast. And aside from that, there's a real environmental issue with wasting a lot of parts of the animal, because people are just buying these cuts and then just ignoring everything else. So many, fine dining restaurants have this focus, on heart and on liver and different things to try to highlight that these things are really delicious and they're really nutrient dense. So one way in which we can also make the most of all of the animal is and extract all the nutrients is by making bone broth and using the bones. And often you can get bones very cheaply or even for free because they're just seen as something that's to be discarded from your local butchery. And you can make something that's really nutrient dense and really full of health benefits. So what are the health benefits of bone broth? So stronger bones. As you age, bones become more brittle and they break more easily and take longer to heal. So the collagen in bone broth basically helps bones become denser and slows the aging process. Skin elasticity and hydration. So as I'm sure you know, like as we age, collagen gets less and less in the body. Collagen goes down, and that's what makes people look older. There's less kind of plumpness and tautness to the skin. Eating collagen in the form of bone broth can really help with that. Thicker hair. So, in one study, a group of women with thinning hair saw significant increases in quantity and scalp coverage and thickness while taking a collagen supplement. Healthier nails. Um, so, one study showed that nails chipped only after 4 weeks of a collagen supplement, reduced osteoarthritis. So people with knee osteoarthritis, collagen supplements act as a pain reliever and improve joint function. But with this, it takes a lot longer. So you need to keep using collagen for 3 to 5 months before you really see improvements on that. Increased muscle mass. So, one small study found that men who took collagen during 12-week strength training programs saw more increase in muscle mass and strength than those who didn't. And again, maybe this relates to this idea of the completeness of collagen, because a lot of people who train in the gym, as I said, they focus on turkey or chicken breast or steaks, and you're really missing a really important part of the animal, which is the collagen, when you're just focusing on the muscle meat. um, so it's a lot more holistic to include that on the diet. So improved heart health. Collagen keeps the shape of your arteries and blood vessels. um, Lack of collagen actually weakens arteries, and fragile blood vessels increase the risk of atherosclerosis, and that's what leads to heart attack or stroke. So basically, collagen keeps the arteries healthy, which reduces the risk of atherosclerosis, which is the trigger for heart disease. So collagen also increases muscle mass and strength. So around 1 to 10% of muscle mass tissue within the body is actually made of collagen. Basically, supplementing collagen can help to potentially contribute towards muscle growth and encourage the creation of creatine, which is a muscle protein. Um, So, what is the difference between? So, one common question that a lot of people have is, what is the difference between making bone broth to get collagen and taking something like a collagen supplement? Um, and the main difference is really that, collagen supplements are basically extracted collagen that's hydrolyzed and broken down into the different types of collagen. There are around 129 different types of collagen, and some are they have different types of roles in the body. And when you get a collagen peptide like this one on the right, the initial, of course, it comes from natural collagen as you see in the animal, but it's broken down, it's hydrolyzed, it's you the collagen peptide is actually isolated into its different forms and then created into a powder. And this is beneficial in the sense that you're getting a very high dose of specific types of collagen, um, and you're getting um, them in precise doses that are different to just having a bone broth. However, the benefits of bone broth is that they contain many, many other nutrients, which I'll go on to show you. But bone broth doesn't just contain collagen; it contains vitamins, minerals. Um, it contains electrolytes. It contains some protein. So it's really what we would consider a whole food product, whereas collagen is really an isolated supplement. Um, and what I would say is that um, we always aim to focus on whole foods and eating whole foods instead of eating food products. And that's a really important thing to kind of keep in mind in general. So definitely, even though bone broth has a lower concentration of, let's say, hyper bioavailable um, collagen peptides, it's still better an overall, food to have because it has all these other benefits. healing the gut and all of these other nutrients, electrolytes, minerals that I speak of. However, the making of bone broth, as we're going to go on to talk about, is quite time consuming. It takes anywhere between 2 to 12 hours to simmer. And usually at that time, you have to be home because, you know, you don't want to set the house on fire. And also this thing of skimming the scummy, frothy parts that come to the surface, and just generally keeping an eye on it. So usually, I usually what I do is I put it on in the morning, and then as I'm working through the day, I just go back to check on it. Um, and then we need to strain it, and then we need to store it, and it doesn't put some in the freezer if there's a lot. So the process is quite laborious, and for that reason, something like a collagen peptide product could be useful. And the way in which I use this is usually I add it to matcha. So, making, for example, any kind of morning drink that you have, if you have coffee with milk or with coconut milk or with almond milk or anything, what you can do is blend a scoop of collagen powder into the coffee, and it actually emulsifies and foams really nicely. And it's totally flavorless also, so it doesn't change the flavor. So you can add it to matcha, you can add it to coffee, you can add it to soups and stews, you can add it to lentils, anything you make, you can add collagen to. And I think that that's a good substitute if you're not actually making bone broth regularly, but the optimal thing is to make the bone broth. So, different types of collagen. So, type 1 gives strength to skin, bone, and ligaments. Type 2 helps with cartilage. Type 3 is found in internal organs and blood vessels. So that's the one that helps with heart disease and atherosclerosis. Type 4 is in some layers of the skin. So this is the benefits of having better skin that we spoke about. And type 5 is in the corneas in your eyes and some layers of skin and hair. So that helps with hair growth and hair thickness. So again, when you take a collagen powder product, often actually the product will say which types of these it includes, and some of them it includes all of them, and it will include them in much higher doses than in the bone broth itself. Um, so as I said, in bone broth, there are other nutrients, so minerals, calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, silicon, and sulfur, and electrolytes, calcium, magnesium, and potassium, vitamins A, B2, B12, and E, and fatty acids, omega 3 and omega 6, amino acids, glycine, proline, glutamine, arginine, and then collagen and gelatin, and glucosamine and chondroitin. So, as you can see, collagen and gelatin, when you buy a collagen product, that's all that's in it. It's just the collagen. There's none of these other things. So this is why bone broth is quite superior in a way. So one question that many people ask when talking about bone broth is, how do you get it to be so gelatinous? Um, because often people will make bone broth and it just turns into this very watery, soupy thing. And essentially, if you have a very high collagen dense bone broth, once it cools and you put it in the fridge overnight, it should turn into kind of a jelly that looks like this. And that's how you know if your bone broth is super gelatinous, that's how you know it's really collagen rich. And that only comes when you really simmer the bones. First of all, it's the type of bones. If you buy the beef bones with a lot of knuckles, and a lot of cartilage that you can actually see on the joints and everything, then those will simmer over a lot of time. In the case of beef bones, you can simmer it overnight, 12 hours. Some people even simmer for a whole day, and it will really break down that collagen. Um, but if you use, for example, chicken bones that don't have too much collagen in them, and you don't put enough bones, then you get a more kind of watery broth. Um, so onto the idea of making broth. Um, so making broth is kind of um, there's a lot of people get stuck on kind of making the perfect broth and making the perfect ratios of broth, of everything in the broth. So I'm going to discuss kind of two different ways to approach making bone broth. And the first is kind of the way in which you measure everything and you weigh everything and you use the perfect ratio of vegetables to bones and you cook for the right amount of time. And this is kind of how they would make what's called a traditional bouillon, which is in French cooking. And, if you go to a French culinary school, for example, they will teach you how to make this in a very specific way, and then that broth will form the basis of soups and stews, and it will be used for risotto, and it will be used to make dressings and to make gravy and all types of things. It's really kind of the basis of many dishes. And of course, you can make it very tasty and you can add a lot of things. And then there's a more kind of traditional home cooking way to do it, which is more accessible. And I'll talk about that afterwards. So, so to start with this, in terms of the ratio, so for every 5 to 8 pounds of bones, you should use 1 pound of mirepoix. And basically, what mirepoix is a mixture of onion, carrot, and celery. And these are kind of the holy trinity of aromatic vegetables that again forms the basis of many dishes in European cooking. Um, so you chop up the vegetables as it's shown a bit there in the picture, roughly chopped, and you add them to the pot with the bones. So it's 1 pound of bone to, um, sorry, 1 pound of mirepoix per gallon of stock broth. So a recipe for 1 gallon of stock would be 5 to 8 pounds of bones and 1 pound of mirepoix. And the ratio of mirepoix vegetables should be, um, oh wait, let's go back to the mirepoix. Should be 2 parts onion and 1 part carrot and 1 part celery. So as you can see there, there's double the amount of onion as there is to celery and carrot. Um, and then, of course, once you understand these ratios, you can scale it up in any way or scale it down depending on how big of a pot that you have. The next thing is adding aromatic herbs. So, people use bay leaf, thyme, peppercorns, cloves, parsley. Again, the amount that you add depends on how strong you want it to be. And it's good to be aware that certain things like ginger, for example, lemon, will really make the flavor, quite strong. And if you're then using the broth for something else, you don't really want that. So this is also the difference between, making a bone broth that you're just going to drink on its own as a health drink, or if you're going to actually use it as the basis for a soup and a stew. And this is what they do in French cooking, right? It's kind of like an underseasoned but still very aromatic and umami broth that is then used to make other things. But you don't want really strong flavors in that, because then imagine you add lemon, but then you want to make like a very subtly flavored soup that you don't want the lemon flavor to be in. So that's also important to think about what you're going to really use it for afterwards. And usually, what people do is they kind of get a little cheesecloth and they pack all of these aromatic vegetables together and then put them in. But you don't have to do that. You can kind of just throw them in. So that is, and I guess there's one more thing that people do. Well, going back to this, is one other way to make it really tasty is actually to pre-roast the bones. So if you get, beef bones, chicken bones, what some people do is roast them in the oven on a high temperature just for like 15-20 minutes to get this really browning flavor. And sometimes people even put tomato paste over the bones. And this really intensifies the flavor, and you get this roasted kind of flavor. Um, and then after that, add them to the pot to simmer. So that's another thing that you can do. So I have here some recipes for chicken broth and for bone broth, which I can share with anyone if they would like. And what people could do is comment or write to me at Michelle at mygotodoc.com. So it's Michelle at mygotodoc, and ask for the recipe, and I'd be happy to share These are the two recipes I usually use for chicken broth, and then this is the one that for beef broth. And as I said, the main differences between chicken and bone broth is that the chicken broths it can be simmered for around 2 to 4 hours, and the beef broth should be simmered for 6 to 8 hours, or even you can even simmer it for a whole day if it's on a really low heat, and that's because the bones of chickens are a lot more kind of fragile and brittle and not as strong, and if you simmer them for too long they start kind of dissolving and you get a gritty kind of broth. Whereas beef bones of course are much more resilient, and they actually need a lot of time to kind of release the collagen. So what I often find is if I don't simmer the beef bones for long enough, I get a very kind of watery stock as opposed to a really gelatinous one. So it's important to do that with the length of time. Um, so the last, um, so the way in which I would say this is a better way to make stock, and the reason why I say that is just because it's more accessible and it's more and also more sustainable. And how that would be would just to be to collect up cuttings, vegetable cuttings. When you're cooking and you cut the head off a carrot, and you cut you cut up the onion, and there's kind of some bits of the outside that you don't use, or maybe there's a few leeks, or um, other hardy vegetables like celery in the fridge that you can't use on a salad because they're slightly not off to the point of rotten, but when vegetables become a bit soft and you can't use them anymore. So it's just about collecting unused parts of the vegetables, and then adding those in like a very haphazard and not precisely measured way. um, and I think that is a better way to approach broth, because then you're basically using all of your offcuts. And so you're making the most and not wasting food. And it's also just more economical. So, one thing that I often do is I make a roast chicken, like a whole chicken. And then the next day, I'll take the bones of that chicken, the carcass, and make it into a broth with just any offcut vegetables that I have. And in that way, you're not buying bones specifically for the broth. And you're also not, using full vegetables or like totally fresh vegetables. You're just kind of using offcuts of what you already have. And in that sense, you're making a roast chicken, and then the carcass of the chicken becomes another meal in of itself. And in that way, you're just constantly recycling and reusing what you have, which is definitely the way that farmers would have traditionally made broth. It was never this thing of measuring everything exactly and making sure the flavor is perfect. It was just about making the most of using what can otherwise be discarded to extract all the nutrients. So I think that's something to bear in mind, because what happens is a lot of people get really stuck on this idea of, what is the right ratio and what is the right temperature, and how long and what vegetables should I use. And, it's almost as if it's this really precise baking recipe where if there's 10 grams of flour less, then it's going to turn out terribly. And it's really not that kind of thing. It's a very haphazard thing where you just throw together things that vegetables and bones that are left over, and then make something from it and extract the nutrients. So I think that's a really good way of starting this process. So I'm going to check out to see any questions. So I grew up with soup bones, but they're hard to find and expensive. When I saw them in stores when they bought them back, is there a vegetarian bone broth? Okay, so yeah, these are two different questions, really. So I think if you look around in different butcheries, of course, the ideal thing is to buy grass-fed and organic bones, which I know are expensive. But secondary to that, I would say it's less important to buy grass-fed in the case of bones, because in the case of muscle meat, we have this issue with the antibiotics and the hormones and all of these kind of things. But with the bones, that's not really the case. There's less toxic exposure. So if you can't buy grass-fed and organic, then you should be able to just buy bones, from the butchery. Um, and yeah, I mean, it depends on where you live. I mean, where I live, they actually give the bones for free because they're just a product that gets discarded otherwise. So you should be able to find some butchers which are happy to give them for not too expensive. Um, in terms of vegetarian bone broth, so there's vegetarian broth, which is basically the same as bone broth, but you're just simmering vegetables, right? You're just using the offcuts and collecting them up over the week, let's say, and then simmering. And that has benefits in the sense that, the vegetables will release their nutrients, their vitamins and minerals and into the water, and the water will become flavorsome, which you can then use to create soups and these kind of things. But there's no collagen in that because the collagen only comes from the bones themselves. It doesn't come from vegetables, so that's important to keep in mind. And there's no protein. It's less mineral rich. It's overall just less nutritious if you don't add bones. But yeah, I mean, I definitely think if we're talking about expense, it makes more sense to make bone broth than it does to buy a collagen um, product. Okay, so next question. I cooked mine in an Instapot. I usually cook it for 3 hours and it's always gelatinous. I use turmeric for inflammation. Does Instapot take away from the nutrition? No, I think that the Instapot is just a kind of an efficient way of cooking, and it just um, it's basically just speeding up the process of extracting the nutrients and also of making the broth. So yeah, I think it's still great, and that's also I mean, Instapot and these kind of things that you can leave and go to work and actually leave the house and not be worried that you're kind of setting the house on fire. That's definitely a really good way to make bone broth because you put it on in the morning and you can just leave. So yeah, that sounds really positive. Any thoughts on store bought broth? I worry it's higher in histamine than fresh bone broth. Yeah. Oh, actually, this is a really good point. So, one of the downsides to bone broth is actually the histamine content. Um, so, bone broth is quite high histamine, and of course, people suffering with long COVID often have issues with histamine. And if you add exogenous histamine in foods, it can be problematic. But the amount of histamine in the broth actually depends on the amount of time that you simmer. So it's better to have a broth that's only been simmered for just a couple of hours. So maybe a chicken broth that's simmered for, let's say, 3-4 hours would be better in terms of histamine than a beef broth that's been simmered for 24 hours. That would be a lot more high histamine. So I think focusing on that. The other downside of the store-bought broths is that often they have a lot of additives. They have to preserve them and sometimes to flavor them, they add dextrose or they add different flavor enhancers. So it's definitely a good idea to check out the ingredient list and make sure that you're getting something that just contains, the bone broth and vegetables and salt. Um, if you have a look on, for example, the Whole30 website, the Whole30 is kind of a paleo's ancestral health website. And if you look up Whole30 approved bone broth, you should be able to see a list of all of the brands that are basically free of additives and preservatives and sugars and these kind of things. But what I found with the store-bought bone broth is that it's never really gelatinous. It's always super watery and liquid, and that's because it would be quite expensive to industrially make a really gelatinous bone broth because the concentration of bones and vegetables to water is quite high concentration of bones and simmered for a really long time. So of course, when they make it industrially, they kind of cut corners with that, and it's just a lot more watery, which basically means it doesn't contain the same amount of collagen. But it's definitely better than nothing, I would say. And if you have the issues with histamine, just try a shorter cooking time broth. Will bone broth heal acne? Um, well, so I mean, bone broth is really good for gut healing. It helps to repair the gut lining. It helps with leaking gut. Often skin issues are a result of gut health issues. Things like dermatitis, eczema, psoriasis, they can often be, the root cause of those things can often be related to gut health because when our gut becomes disrupted, we basically let undigested food particles into the system, and then that creates some kind of inflammatory and autoimmune reaction in the body. Um, so if for any reason, if that your acne is kind of exacerbated or caused by gut issues, then bone broth could definitely help alleviate that. But acne is often, a hormonal imbalance, and that can be caused by so many different things. One thing being gut health. Gut health and hormone health are really linked, but there are many other things that could also cause acne. So it's definitely a good idea to just always look into the root cause of what's causing acne. Um, but of course, trying bone broth isn't going to hurt and could help if the problem is actually gut health related. Does dissolving chicken bouillon cubes have the same effects as bone broth? Okay, this is a good question. So no, actually those the cubes are really, I mean, you can get better ones and worse ones. There are ones that have relatively okay ingredients, and there are some that have really terrible ingredients, just loads of MSG and flavor enhancers and all kinds of crazy preservatives and things that kind of trigger your taste buds in a certain way. And of course, there's no gelatin because they're not actually using bones to make those cubes. It's just a flavor enhancer essentially. It's usually some kind of chemical, um, highly processed, highly concentrated flavor enhancer that is totally different to making broth because you don't have any of the gelatinousness from the actual bones. You don't have the minerals. You don't have the vitamins. It's a completely different thing. And I would say it's even, unless you're buying a really high quality one, I would say it's not going to be good for health at all. So I would definitely recommend to avoid those. It's probably better to just use water than use those, I would say. How often do you include this in your diet? Once a week. So, um, so I think that you can consume bone broth every day. Again, people with histamine issues might notice that it can be inflammatory for them, and in that case, they shouldn't have as much, and they should also, um, try the shorter cooking times. But yeah, you can consume it in a soup. You can just drink a cup of it on its own with a bit of apple cider vinegar and salt. You can add it to stews. Definitely daily consumption. I mean, um, it's not something that is like, let's say, a vitamin or like an isolated supplement where you can actually overdo that thing and cause negative outcomes. However, with collagen supplements, it can be the case that you can take too much because, as I said, they're not a whole food product. They're this very isolated, in a way, industrialized product. And you're taking very isolated, high concentrated amounts of a certain collagen peptide. And when we do that, what happens is it can imbalance the other amino acids in our body, and our body doesn't really recognize that in such a high concentration. So that's why with collagen supplements, we have to be more careful than with broth, which is a whole food. And it would be like saying, oh, is there a health risk to eating too many oranges? I mean, there probably is if you just ate 200 of them in a day, but no one's really going to do that. I think that, consuming it every day as in a cup, or in a soup or in a stew is the best way to do it. Okay. Not familiar with histamine issues in bone broth or any foods. I'm allergic to tomatoes per tests. Um, so I try not to have them. It's hard to avoid so much. Um, okay, so I think this person, yeah, I mean, if you don't have histamine issues, it's okay to consume bone broth. Um, so tomatoes are a nightshade vegetable. So if you have issues with nightshade vegetables, that's quite different to histamine issues. Although some nightshades are also high histamine. Okay, so another question. Kettle and fire broth doesn't have any preservatives and vegetables. It's not super gelatinous and it doesn't say how long they simmer it for. So yeah, the kettle and fire bone broth is actually, sorry, excuse me, a good one. It's one of the ones that's Whole30 approved and also doesn't, as you said, doesn't have preservatives. But yeah, it's not super gelatinous because, as I said, when they make these things industrially, they of course want to make money and just maximize the output. So it's never going to be the same as making it at home and like the picture I showed you where it was just totally gelatinous. So someone asked, how often do you include this in your diet? Oh, I think I've already asked that one. So answered that one. So the last one about storage. So this is important actually. So it's important to cool bone broth as quickly as possible after cooking it because bacteria can grow really quickly. It's kind of the perfect breeding ground for bacteria because it's this meat and vegetables which has been simmering on a low heat for a really long time. So what I usually do is I take the pot and I put it into like an ice bath in the sink. So I fill the sink with ice and water, and then I put another pot into the ice bath, and then I pour the broth. Well, strain the broth because you want to strain out the bones, right? You want to strain the bones and the vegetables, and I just let it cool down for as quickly as possible in an ice bath and then put it in the fridge. And yeah, I mean, it's not a huge concern, but it is a good idea to try to, like, for example, what not to do is just to leave it out for days on the stovetop without refrigerating. That would be, a good breeding ground for bacteria. It's good to just try to cool it as quickly as you can and then put it in the fridge. And you should probably use it within a couple of days. And if you know that you're not going to use it, then you should put it in the freezer, and then it will keep for a lot longer. But what I usually do is I make it into something immediately after cooking. I then make it into a bolognese or a soup or a stew of some kind. Um, and then after that, if you made a large batch, let's say of stew, you can freeze that itself. But otherwise, freezing the broth in smaller usable containers is a good idea. Um, I think that's it for the questions. Um, Great. Yeah, thanks for everyone's interest in this subject. I'm sure there's a lot more to talk about in terms of broth. It's funny. I thought that maybe this wouldn't be enough to talk about in a live, and then when I started, actually making this presentation, I was like, oh wow, there's so much to talk about when it comes to bone broth. So we have a new Phoenix Protocol group coaching program that's coming up on the 1st of April. So if anyone is interested in joining, you can scan the code here to find out more. And you can also book a discovery call with me if you want to find out if you're, if what the Phoenix Protocol is really about, and also if you'd be a good match for joining it. So thank you very much for listening, and I will see you again next week.